Hello everyone and welcome to my talk. My name is Emil Bronstein and I am a PhD student in the Faculty of Mechanical Engineering at the Technion. And today I'm going to talk about twin boundary motion. Now, twin boundary motion basically governs the plastic deformation of many materials and material classes, and it can be investigated using two different approaches, either with slowly loaded material or with rapidly loaded material. Let's begin with the slow rate tests. So what has been found during slow rate tests is that actually twin boundary motion takes place by some discrete and impulsive, very rapid events that we call them avalanches. And these avalanches can be observed using different sensors. For example, we can measure the stress or the force of the material versus the time. And then these avalanche events during which the twin boundary propagates are manifested as stress drops, these rapid stress changes during which the twin boundary motion takes place. And what is usually done in the literature to analyze twin boundary motion through the avalanche events is to consider different variables of avalanches and plot their statistics. For example, we can consider the maximal amplitudes of avalanches, their energies, durations, etc., and then plot, as in this case, the probability density function. And a commonly observed in the literature result is that variables of avalanches follow straight lines known as power laws, at least in some range. On the other hand, we can turn to high rate tests in which we measure the twin boundary velocity as a function of the driving force during rapid loading of the material. And for each different driving force, we have the velocity that are scattered for each of them. And what is actually has been found is that these velocity changes are bounded from above by something that we call a kinetic law in a defect-free crystal. And it is given by this red line here. So this brings us to the following questions and knowledge gap. Because during slow rate tests, we just saw that there are avalanches, but before our research, no one talked about kinetic laws. And during high rate tests, we saw that there are kinetic laws, but before our research, no one talked about avalanches. So our questions are there kinetic laws during slow rate tests? And are there avalanches during high rate tests? Which brings me to our research goal and methodology. So our goal is to investigate twin boundary motion at nanometer and microsecond scales via direct measurements during slow rate loading. And we will do that by developing a novel experimental method in which we will simultaneously measure the force and the magnetic emission of the material, a nickel manganese gallium single crystal in this case, of course, during twin boundary motion. Now, why would we like to measure the force of the material? Because it provides us with direct information about twin boundary motion. Direct in what sense? In the sense that by measuring the stress of the material and through known geometry and material parameters, we can gain access to the variable Vt, which represents the volumes that undergo twinning transformation during these avalanche events. However, these force measurements have a limitation because they capture relatively slow and large events. On the other hand, we can turn to magnetic emission measurements, which are highly advantageous because they have the capability of capturing very small and rapid events. And we can develop a similar relation for them, in which we will relate the magnetic emission voltage through known geometry and material parameters to the almost same variable Vt, but just now it has a dot, so a time derivative, which represents the rate of change of volumes that undergo twinning transformation. However, let me note that this relation is not true for all materials and all experimental conditions. Actually, we had to develop and design experimental conditions and tailor them such that this relation will be valid and we will propose it. So we still need to validate this relation and remove this question mark. So let's do it. Now we will validate the relation between the measured voltage V and the variable Vt dot. And we will do it by considering the following stress drop, which, by the way, is not an easy stress drop to analyze. It's not that smooth. And according to the relation in the previous slide, this signal is proportional to the variable Vt. Now let's take a look at the magnetic emission signal, which corresponds to this stress drop and was measured simultaneously with it and during this stress drop. This is how it looks like. Now, according to our proposed relation, this magnetic emission voltage should be proportional to Vt dot, which means that the time integral over the blue magnetic emission signal should yield something that is similar to the black stress drop. Does it? Apparently it does. This is how it looks like. So encouraged and motivated by these results, we went on and analyzed the correlation between the variable Vt obtained from the stress or force measurements and the same variable Vt that was obtained from the time integral of the magnetic emission measurements. And our results indicate that over 97% of 216 detected stress drops in 9 different experiments all have a Pearson correlation coefficient larger than 90%, which leads to the conclusion that using our developed method, we can indeed investigate wind boundary motion directly at nanometer and microsecond scales using the magnetic emission sensor. So here are some of the results of this investigation. As we are at slow rate test, we analyze the statistics of variables of avalanches. And here I choose to focus on the variable Vt dot max, which represent the maximal rate of volume that undergo twinning transformation. And it can be viewed as the maximal twin boundary velocity just in terms of cubic meters per second. So this is how the statistics or the CCDF, the complementary cumulative distribution function of this variable looks like, to which we propose to fit the following magenta distribution. So we propose the commonly observed in the literature power law part, which we truncated by this decaying exponential function with a cutoff value of Vt dot max cutoff. And we can make 2 observations from this proposed distribution. The first one is that this distribution fits the measured data well in most of the measured range. And by the way, let me note that we observe the same behavior in the other variables that we investigated, and I am just not showing here. And the second and maybe even more interesting observation we can make is about the location of the cutoff value, which is found approximately in the middle of this measured data, which indicates that it originates from some sort of a limit on this physical process rather than being found somewhere at the end, and its origin might be something mathematical or experimental. And based on this observation, we went on and proposed a physical meaning for the cutoff value of this variable Vt dot max. And we did that by comparing our results to results that were obtained from high rate tests and were performed exactly on the same material as we studied. So in these high rate tests, the twin boundary velocity VTB was measured as a function of the driving force G. And we can once again see the velocity scattered for different values of the driving force. And out of these velocities, we marked by black squares the maximal velocity values, and we fitted them with this red line. So this red line basically represents the upper bound for the velocity changes of the twin boundary, or simply said, the kinetic law. Then we asked ourselves, what is the driving force G in our experiments? And this value is 30 kilojoules per cubic meter. So we extrapolated this kinetic law and reached this value and obtained the upper bound in terms of the twin boundary velocity. Now We compare this value to the cutoff value of VT dot max, which is divided it by the twin boundary areas. So now these two values have the same units of meters per second. And note this remarkable match between the value that was obtained during slow rate test, the cutoff value of VT dot max, and the value that was predicted by the kinetic law that was obtained during high rate tests that were performed on the same material. And we explain this match by considering hierarchies of avalanches. So this is what the force sensor sees. This is what it captures. And if we will zoom in on one such individual stress drop, we will find that it is in fact composed of many much smaller scale magnetic emission avalanches. And we observe exactly the same behavior for all of our stress drop avalanches that we detected. And we suggest that based on this hierarchical structure of avalanches, that if we had the ability to zoom in on an individual magnetic emission avalanche event, we will find that it is actually composed of much smaller scale avalanches that will be here in this huge 9 orders of magnitude unexplored gap. And we can relate this finding to high rate tests as well, because if we said that each force drop is composed of numerous magnetic emission avalanches, and we will zoom in on one such individual magnetic emission avalanche, we just saw that they are bounded from above by the cutoff value of VT dot max. But we observe exactly the same behavior during high rate tests, where the velocity changes are also bounded from above by the kinetic law. And we just showed that they are exactly the same value, or almost exactly the same value. And based on the hierarchical structure of the avalanches, we suggest that if we have the ability to zoom in on these events, we will find that they are composed of even smaller events that are small enough to follow the kinetic law for twin boundary motion. So to conclude, we developed a novel experimental method in which we related directly the magnetic emission measurements to twin boundary motion, which enabled us to study this motion at nanometer and microsecond scales. We showed that the origin of the cutoff value of VT dot max is actually the kinetic law in a defect-free crystal. And we suggested that there are additional unexplored smaller hierarchies that are just below the detection capabilities of the magnetic emission sensor, and they are small enough to follow the kinetic law. And lastly, the same twin boundary behavior occurs both during slow and high rate tests and can therefore be explained by the same theory. So are there kinetic laws during slow rate tests? Yes, there are. And are there avalanches during high rate tests? Yes, there are. Thank you very much for listening. If you are interested in this research, you can find more details in this publication, and please feel free to reach out and contact me via this email address. Thank you very much.